So this cut is what is commonly referred to as the prime rib. We in the industry would call it an export rib because it's designed and trimmed in such a way that anywhere all over the world would know the specifications of how this piece of meat would be trimmed and fabricated. This is the whole rib on the beef. There are 13, sometimes 14 ribs per animal. This piece of meat has 7 ribs. So this would go from not the very bottom one, but the second to the bottom rib, and then up 7. Bottom rib would stay on the New York. As you come up to the other side, the other ribs stay on the chuck, which is at the shoulder. So this we refer to as the loin end, and this we refer to as the chuck end. I'm using an unaged piece here and I have an aged piece. It's easier to visualize and see the differences in the two cuts before it starts aging. But we'll cut this one up to show you how this piece of meat would actually break down. One interesting thing about this piece of meat is it's changed the way that they prepare them. Back in the 60s and the 70s, you would never get a piece of meat that looked like this. The prime rib was done very similar to this on this end, but then they would leave what's in this, for all intended purposes, short rib type meat on the outside. And so what you had is a roast that was from this end predominantly the rib, but then you would start to pick up a lot of other parts of the meat, which were not as good as the rib, but they had weight, so you're going to pay for that. So as a result, most people would ask for the first cut because that would have the minimal amount of additional meat and fat and weight on it that is not part of the roast. Nowadays, the way that the piece is trimmed from one end to the other, you basically have just the ribs and the meat. So the nice thing about the way they're doing these now is this rib is complete rib. It's complete the best part of the rib with not the additional stuff put on it. The one little bit of loss in my world is the fat. They used to have more of a fat cap on the outside, but that's a thing of the past because in order to get that other meat out of there, you have to take that off. So that's why they're doing them in this fashion. Another interesting thing about the export rib, or the prime rib as it's commonly called, is the actual muscles will change as they move up towards the chuck. As you can see here, this is one solid piece here. This is where the New York would be coming from. As it transits this way to the other side, you'll see a number of separations. This over here has become what we call the rib cap, the spinalis. And at this end, it's virtually non-existent. You can see a little tiny bit of it right here, right? This is the start of it. But by the time it gets to the other end, it's quite large. That is when you cook a prime rib and slice it, the outside, there'll be always a piece that's a little bit darker. It's also like the piece that everybody I know goes to first. That's the spinalis. And the reason for that attraction is that it has so much flavor and it cooks so nicely on the outside that it's really, it is the best part of the prime rib slice. The other interesting thing is your bones are going to be different sizes. So for example, at the New York end, on this cut, you have about a 6-inch, maybe more, length of a rib. But as you move to the chuck end, it drops down to about 2 inches. So you have a natural shaping of that. If you've ever been in a restaurant and had the tomahawk, what they simply do is they leave this rib, instead of making this cut here, they make the cut way out here and then take the meat off it. But this is exactly the same piece of meat that you would see as a tomahawk, except the bone left longer. First thing we're going to do to process is we're going to what's called face it. We're going to cut the edge off the end. It only requires a very small cut, and you'll see that the inside of the meat is fantastic. So the next step is we're going to trim some of this exterior edge. This is something we do whether it's dry aged or wet aged, because when the chine bone is removed from here, there's sometimes some fascia that stays on this, and it actually would would not toughen it, but it would detract from the tenderness. So to make sure that it's the perfect cut, we're going to take that off. So now at this point we're ready to start fabricating this cut into whatever it is that our intention is. The reason I say that is it's a very versatile piece of meat. You can do, any number of things with it. This would be, from here you cut the rib steak, you cut the rib eye, you can do prime rib roast, you can do a boneless roast, a boneless ribeye roast. For the sake of what we're doing here, I wanted to show a couple of unusual cuts that we make out of this piece of meat. We make a mini tomahawk, and we make what we call a Jorge. So I'm going to make those cuts. So you'll see how they are fabricated. Let's go ahead and cut a mini tomahawk. So what we've done is we've taken an entire rib and cut it from the piece. Then what we'll do is we'll do some fine tuning that I didn't do on the original trim. And then you can see this part here is predominantly fat. So what we'll do is we'll do something, it's called Frenching the bone. It kind of originated with racks of lamb, but it's the same idea. And then we'll do a little bit more trimming. As you can see, there's a little bit of an excess fat there. And that would be the mini tomahawk. Interesting thing about when this cooks, it will pull back a little bit from the bone, so when you're done, the bone will be extended another ½ an inch to an inch. But this is exactly the cut that would be the tomahawk, except that bone is going to come out to here. We like this better. It gives you kind of the effect of the exposed bone, but you're not paying for all that extra bone, because the meat would be the same whether the bone was 2 inches or 8 inches. So this way you've got a better value in terms of what's actually edible on the cut. I'm going to cut the Jorge steak from this end of the rib, which would be the chuck end or the shoulder end. And the reason for it is the specs on the Jorge require the spinalis muscle to be a major part of it. Again, we're cutting a full bone rib. In this you'll get a better example of the 3 different muscles that have come together at this end of the cut. So this is exactly what we call the Jorge cut. You can see it's about a 2-inch thick, has the full bone, but it's the shorter bone, but it has all the variations of the different muscles from the chuck shoulder end. So with this piece, originally 7 bones, we've taken 1 rib off of the loin end, and we've taken 1 rib off of the chuck or the shoulder end. The visual here is pretty neat because you can see how dramatically different the 2 ends of the same piece will look. And so what's happening is where it was 1 single muscle, you're starting to get a new one that's forming and coming down. And when it gets to this end, you can see that new muscle has become predominant on this side here. So it's elongating as it moves down, even on just the few 5 ribs that are remaining. So I'm going to take a couple of these ribs off intact, and then I'll pull the bones out of it, and we'll actually turn it into boneless ribeye steaks. So one obvious thing from this picture is the fat that has appeared. You can see it had its origin here, but as it transits, as it moves down the rib, just like the muscles are changing, the fat changes. And so you can see you're starting to get a little bit of an interior fat. That's about as much as would occur, and in the remaining piece, within about another 3-4 inches, it'll dissipate and be negligible. But In my world, the fat is flavor, so this gets my attention all the time. If you're not as big a fan of fat and you want something leaner, then you're much better off going from this end, which would be called the loin end. That will be a leaner cut than will be the chuck or shoulder end. Let's go ahead and make some boneless ribeye steaks. This would be called the back rib. It's the exact same cut as a pork back rib, only from beef. Again, you could cut this to any size. We now have it's a boneless ribeye. It needs a little bit more trimming, but it's just up to us to decide what thickness we want. When you're cutting something like this, I'm going to cut this into 4. Just a little trick, rather than starting here and cutting to 4, work with halves. So if you're going to cut 4 pieces and you cut this in half first, and then you cut your halves in half, you're going to have uniform thicknesses. It's very simple if you start here to cut and then end up with a smaller cut on the end. So this is your boneless ribeye steak. So with the remaining piece, this is a center cut 3-bone prime rib. What we will do with this is finish trimming it as if we're going to roast it. So now that's ready to go. We could make a fantastic roast beef out of that. Something like this would probably cook in under 2 hours, hour and 45 minutes, depending on the methodology. So a rule of thumb that I use, and this would be for healthy appetites, that you could easily serve 2 people per rib. So this is a 3-bone roast. You could easily serve 6 people with this. The maximum that they come is 7 ribs. So that would be approximately 14 to 15 people that you could serve off of that piece. One suggestion, if you're in a situation where you have more than 14, for example, say 20, don't do a whole one and a half a one. What you want to do is to get as uniform sizes as possible, so you could do 2 5s or a 6 and a 5. If they're the same mass and the same size, you can cook them together and they'll cook as if they were one. And it's much easier, 2 uniform ones than 1 big one and 1 little one. We've got a roast beef here that would be commonly referred to as a prime rib, but it's not necessarily a USDA prime grade prime rib. For example, this cut could be a select prime rib, a USDA choice prime rib, or in our case, a USDA prime rib. So the name is kind of a colloquial name. Don't let it fool you. Pay attention to the grade of what you're getting as well. One thing to consider when you're serving a roast beef like this, with the bone in, it's going to be some amount of difficulty in terms of carving it, of slicing it. A couple of options would be, one, simply take your first, as thick as you want, cut down to the bone and kind of pull it off. The next cut would probably go through and the bone would be separated, and you continue like that. Another option would be to tip it on its side after it's cooked and slice the bones off. The problem with that is it's very unwieldy. The meat's going to be hot. It's going to be a very, very difficult process to do. Both of them are not the easiest in terms of slicing. One of the things that we like to do, and you can ask your butcher to do this for you, is have the bones cut off and tied back on before you cook it. So here we have the entire rib plate pulled off. We're simply going to replace it. One thing to keep in mind is, because it came off intact and we're putting it exactly back where it was, it will seal up through cooking, and you're not going to have a problem with losing excessive juice out of it or any kind of issue with cooking. It'll cook exactly as if that had never been removed. So as you can see, it's come back almost exactly as it was taken off. Now you do the same cooking procedure, anything you want to do with it, but when you're done, you just simply cut the strings and you can lift the boneless ribeye right off the plate of ribs. The ribs will be fully cooked and you cut between them to serve. So this is a very good example of how versatile and how many different things you can do with this single prime rib. We started at this end with the mini Tomahawk, and then we came up with a 3-bone prime rib that we cut the bones off, tied it back on for ease of slicing. Then we decided to take 2 more ribs and cut them into boneless rib eyes coming out of this section. And we ended with what we call the Jorge, which is a full bone cut from the chuck or the shoulder end. The item that's not really being shown here that we could also do is we can do a thinner, not quite the full bone thickness, we can do a rib steak that is a thinner thickness but still has a bone in it. That we would do on a bandsaw. That's not something we do by hand, but it's capable of that. So you're seeing 4 of the 5 different things that we can do with just this one piece of meat. Hopefully it gives you some ideas of how you can do things at home or variations that you can order.